Most people think inflation is something that simply happens. Prices go up, money buys less, governments respond, central banks adjust. It feels impersonal, almost natural, like bad weather or aging infrastructure. Unpleasant, but unavoidable. For a long time, that explanation felt reasonable. Inflation appeared in waves, often tied to wars, shortages, or visible crises. It seemed like an unfortunate side effect of instability, not a deliberate feature of the system itself. But there is a pattern hiding in plain sight. Across different countries, different decades, and radically different political systems, inflation keeps producing the same outcome. Not occasionally, not by accident. The same groups lose purchasing power first, the same groups recover last, and the same groups, quietly, absorb the cost of keeping the system functioning. This raises a question that most discussions avoid. If inflation hurts everyone, why does it always hurt some people more than others? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Poorer households spend a larger share of their income on essentials. When prices rise, they feel it faster. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete. It describes the effect without explaining the mechanism. Because inflation does not merely reduce purchasing power, it redistributes it. To see this clearly, it helps to step away from modern debates and look at how societies once understood rising prices. For much of history, inflation was treated as a sign of failure, a breach of trust, a breakdown in authority. Debasing currency was associated with instability, corruption, or desperation. Rulers who allowed money to lose value were seen as undermining the social contract. That stigma mattered. It constrained behavior. When money was scarce, and its creation visibly tied to physical limits, inflation was difficult to hide. The consequences appeared quickly. Confidence eroded. Social tension rose. Political authority weakened. In those conditions, inflation was dangerous not only economically, but politically. This is why earlier societies feared it. Over time, that fear faded. As monetary systems evolved, inflation became less visible and more abstract. It was no longer framed as debasement, but as adjustment. No longer as failure, but as management. Language changed first. Perception followed. By the mid-20th century, inflation had been rebranded. It was no longer something to be avoided at all cost. It became something to be controlled, tolerated, and even used. Moderate inflation was described as healthy, necessary, a sign of growth rather than decay. That shift was subtle but profound. Once inflation was normalized, it stopped being treated as a political choice and started being treated as a technical outcome, something produced by complex forces, beyond the control of ordinary people, and often beyond the accountability of decision makers. But the distributional effects never disappeared. Inflation does not strike society evenly. It moves through it in a predictable order. Those closest to the creation of money feel it last. Those farthest from it feel it first. This is not theory. It is observable, repeatable, and historically consistent. The people who rely on wages fixed in nominal terms experience rising prices before they see rising income. Those living on savings watch purchasing power erode without any adjustment at all. Those dependent on public transfers often wait years for recalibration, if it comes at all. Meanwhile, those positioned near credit assets and financial leverage adjust faster, sometimes instantly, sometimes automatically. This asymmetry is not incidental. It is structural. To understand why inflation punishes the poor first, you have to understand how modern money enters the economy and who gets access to it. Before prices adjust, that story begins not with households, but with states. Modern inflation is inseparable from modern government finance. When states face pressure, war, recession, crisis, or political promises they cannot fund through taxation alone, borrowing becomes the path of least resistance. Debt fills the gap, and when debt grows large enough, inflation becomes the mechanism that makes it manageable. This is not usually described openly. Inflation is rarely presented as debt management. It is framed as stimulus, stabilization, or growth support, but the effect is the same. Rising prices reduce the real value of existing obligations. What cannot be paid directly is diluted over time. The burden shifts quietly. This shift does not require malicious intent. It requires structure. Once debt becomes permanent and money creation becomes flexible, inflation stops being an accident. It becomes an option, a tool that can relieve pressure without triggering immediate political backlash. Taxes are visible. Spending cuts are painful. Inflation operates in the background. And because it operates in the background, its costs are easier to ignore, especially when those costs fall disproportionately on people with the least margin for error. By the time inflation becomes a political issue, the damage is already done. This pattern became unmistakable in the 1970s, when inflation surged across advanced economies. In the United States, Wages lagged behind prices. Savings lost value. Living standards stagnated, even as economic output continued to grow. Those with assets found protection. Those without fell behind. But this was not an isolated episode. Similar dynamics played out across Latin America during periods of chronic inflation, where entire generations saw savings wiped out repeatedly. In parts of Europe, inflation quietly restructured post-war societies, redistributing wealth without explicit legislation. Each time, the same logic applied. Inflation did not destroy the system. It preserved it by shifting the cost of adjustment downward. This is why inflation rarely leads to revolt on its own. It erodes rather than shocks. It fragments rather than mobilizes. It allows the system to continue functioning while slowly reshaping social outcomes. And this brings us to the central insight that most discussions avoid. Inflation is not primarily a price phenomenon. It is a power phenomenon. It determines who absorbs risk, who bears uncertainty, and who is forced to adapt. It rewards proximity to financial flexibility and punishes dependence on fixed income and delayed adjustment. Once you see inflation this way, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Across time and geography, the poor are not punished because they are irresponsible, inefficient, or unlucky. They are punished because of where they sit within the monetary system. They feel inflation. Those without these advantages did not. This uneven impact was not hidden, but it was rarely framed as a design problem. Inflation was treated as an unfortunate macroeconomic condition, something to be tamed through policy rather than understood through power dynamics. That framing mattered. By treating inflation as a technical issue, responsibility was diffused. No one was directly accountable for its distributional effects. The conversation focused on percentages and targets rather than consequences and priorities. When inflation slowed in the following decades, the underlying structure did not disappear. It simply became quieter. From the 1980s onward, inflation in many advanced economies remained relatively low and stable. This period was often described as a triumph of monetary policy. Central banks gained credibility. Inflation targeting became orthodoxy. Stability was celebrated as evidence that the problem had been solved. But the system had not been dismantled. It had been refined. Low and predictable inflation does not eliminate redistribution. It smooths it. Instead of sudden shocks, purchasing power erodes gradually. Instead of visible crises, inequality widens silently. The effect is slower, but no less real. And when inflation returns, as it inevitably does, the same pattern reasserts itself. The early stages are always the most revealing. Prices begin to rise before wages adjust. Essentials become more expensive first. Food, energy, housing. The items that consume the largest share of lower-income budgets feel the pressure immediately. Those living paycheck to paycheck have no buffer, no portfolio to rebalance, no assets that automatically reprice. Inflation is not an abstract statistic for them. It is an immediate constraint. By the time incomes adjust, if they adjust at all, purchasing power has already been lost. This sequence is not accidental. Modern economies distribute new money unevenly. Credit expansion flows first through financial institutions, corporations, and governments. Asset prices respond before consumer prices do. Those positioned early benefit from rising valuations. Those positioned late face higher costs without compensation. This process has been observed repeatedly across countries and decades. It does not depend on ideology. It does not require conspiracy. It follows from how monetary systems are structured. Inflation punishes the poor first because the poor are last in line. This dynamic becomes even clearer in countries that experience chronic inflation. In parts of Latin America, inflation was not an episodic event but a recurring condition. Prices rose not over months, but over years and decades. Savings became meaningless. Long-term planning collapsed. Those with access to hard assets or foreign currency adapted. Those without watched their earnings evaporate repeatedly. In these environments, inflation reshaped social behavior. People rushed to spend money as soon as they received it. Trust in institutions eroded. Economic life became defensive rather than productive. Survival replaced accumulation. Yet even here, inflation did not dismantle the system. It allowed it to persist under strain. Governments avoided outright default. Obligations were diluted rather than repudiated. The cost was borne by households least able to absorb it. This pattern raises an uncomfortable question. If inflation consistently shifts burdens downward, why is it tolerated? Part of the answer lies in visibility. Inflation does not arrive with a single decision or a clear moment of responsibility. It unfolds gradually. Its effects are dispersed. Blame is difficult to assign. Unlike taxes, which provoke immediate resistance, inflation feels impersonal. Another part lies in fragmentation. Inflation affects people differently depending on income, assets, and timing. It does not unify opposition. It divides experience. Some benefit, others suffer. This makes collective response harder. But the most important reason is structural. Modern states are built around promises that exceed what taxation alone can support. Inflation becomes the release valve. It allows governments to honor nominal commitments while quietly reducing their real cost. This preserves political stability in the short term, even as it undermines social cohesion in the long term. From this perspective, inflation is not a failure of policy. It is a compromise embedded in the system. The poor are punished first not because they are targeted, but because they lack insulation. They absorb volatility before it reaches those with more protection. They adjust through reduced consumption, degraded living standards, and increased precarity. This is why inflation rarely provokes immediate revolt. It wears people down rather than shocking them into action. It forces adaptation rather than confrontation. And yet, this quiet erosion has consequences. Over time, inflation reshapes expectations. It teaches people not to save, not to trust stability, not to believe that effort guarantees security. It alters behavior in ways that persist long after prices stabilize. The question, then, is not whether inflation hurts the poor. That much is obvious. The deeper question is why systems continue to rely on a mechanism that produces this outcome so reliably. The answer lies not in malice, but in incentives. Inflation spreads cost without concentrating blame. It maintains nominal order while redistributing real value. It preserves the appearance of stability while quietly altering its substance. Once you understand this, inflation stops looking like an accident. It begins to look like a tool. The consequences of inflation become clearer when it is no longer treated as theory, but as lived experience. Few periods illustrate this better than the United States in the 1970s. For decades after the Second World War, American households had grown accustomed to stability. Wages rose steadily. Savings retained value. A single income could support a family, buy a home, and build a future. Inflation existed, but it was low enough to feel irrelevant. That changed abruptly. As prices began rising faster than wages, something subtle but deeply unsettling occurred. People were working just as hard, often harder, yet falling behind. Paychecks arrived on schedule, but they no longer stretched as far. Groceries, fuel, rent, everyday expenses absorbed more income each month. This was not perceived as a redistribution. It was felt as confusion, as frustration, as the sense that the rules had changed without warning. Those with fixed incomes suffered immediately. Retirees watched savings erode. Workers with limited bargaining power saw real wages decline. Labor contracts lagged behind prices, and by the time adjustments arrived, purchasing power was already gone. Meanwhile, asset holders experienced a different reality. Real estate prices rose. Stocks adjusted. Debt became easier to service in real terms. Borrowers benefited from repaying obligations with cheaper money. The same inflation produced opposite outcomes depending on position. This divergence forced a response. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, U.S. monetary policy shifted dramatically under the leadership of Paul Volcker. Interest rates were raised aggressively to break inflation, even at the cost of recession. Unemployment rose. Businesses failed. The pain was immediate and visible. Inflation slowed. Credibility was restored. But the structural lesson remained. Inflation had been tamed not because it was unjust, but because it threatened stability at the top of the system. Once confidence was restored, the deeper distributional dynamics were left largely unaddressed. Over time, inflation receded from public consciousness. Prices rose slowly. Stability returned. The system appeared to work again, but the mechanics never disappeared. They resurfaced decades later, after the global financial crisis and again following the pandemic. Massive monetary expansion stabilized markets and prevented collapse. Asset prices surged. Financial wealth recovered quickly. Wages did not. When inflation returned, it followed the same path it always had. Essentials rose first. Housing became less affordable. Energy costs spiked. Food prices climbed. For households already operating at the margin, the impact was immediate. The question was no longer whether inflation punished the poor first. It was how often the pattern could repeat before trust eroded permanently. To see where inflation's effects are most concentrated, it helps to look beyond advanced economies. In countries with chronic inflation, the dynamic becomes impossible to ignore. In Argentina, for example, inflation has repeatedly destroyed the value of wages and savings. Entire generations learned that holding money was a losing strategy. Long-term planning became irrational. People adapted by converting income into goods immediately, by seeking foreign currency, by operating defensively rather than productively. Inflation reshaped behavior, not just balance sheets. Those with access to financial instruments or foreign assets found protection. Those without lived in a constant state of erosion. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. In Brazil, hyperinflation in the late 20th century turned everyday transactions into exercises in urgency. Prices changed daily. Trust collapsed. Stability became a privilege rather than a norm. In each case, inflation did not end inequality. It entrenched it. What makes inflation so effective as a mechanism is not its severity, but its selectivity. It does not strike uniformly. It flows through existing structures, amplifying differences that already exist. Those closest to money creation adjust first. Governments, banks, large corporations, they operate with flexibility. They can borrow, hedge, renegotiate. They can pass cost forward. Households cannot. This asymmetry explains why inflation persists even when its effects are widely acknowledged. It resolves problems at the system level while concentrating pain at the margins. It keeps institutions solvent while forcing individuals to adapt. And adaptation, in this context, means sacrifice, lower quality consumption, delayed milestones, reduced savings, increased dependence on credit. Each adjustment is small on its own, but cumulative in effect. Over time, inflation changes the relationship between effort and outcome. Hard work no longer guarantees security. Prudence no longer protects savings. Planning becomes speculation. This is not merely an economic shift, it is a social one. When people lose faith that stability is achievable through ordinary means, trust erodes. Institutions feel distant. Rules feel arbitrary. The future feels uncertain, even during periods of growth. This erosion does not produce immediate collapse. It produces disengagement, and disengagement is difficult to reverse. The most uncomfortable implication of this pattern is that inflation functions as a filter. It determines who absorbs uncertainty so that others do not have to. It is a way of allocating risk without explicit consent. Those with buffers survive. Those without adapt or fall behind. This is why inflation is often defended as a necessary evil, not because its effects are misunderstood, but because its alternatives are politically costly. Raising taxes directly provokes resistance. Cutting spending creates visible losers. Inflation diffuses responsibility. No single decision can be blamed. No single actor can be targeted. The system continues to function. From the perspective of stability, inflation works. From the perspective of equity, it does not. This tension sits at the heart of modern economic governance. States rely on inflation to manage pressures they cannot otherwise resolve. Central banks frame it as a technical variable. Households experience it as a lived constraint. Each perspective is internally consistent. Together, they reveal the core problem. Inflation punishes the poor first not because policymakers choose winners and losers explicitly, but because the structure ensures that those with the least flexibility absorb change earliest and most fully. The deeper question, then, is not whether inflation can be controlled. It is whether a system that repeatedly relies on inflation can ever be neutral, and whether a society that accepts this mechanism can honestly claim that outcomes are purely the result of individual effort. Those questions are rarely asked openly, but they linger beneath every price increase, every shrinking paycheck, every promise that stability will return once conditions normalize. History suggests that normalization is temporary. The mechanism remains. The final piece of the puzzle becomes visible when we stop asking why inflation exists and start asking who is insulated from it. Because while inflation punishes the poor first with remarkable consistency, it does not punish everyone equally. Some groups, some institutions, and some countries experience inflation very differently, not because they are smarter or more virtuous, but because of where they sit within the system. Consider sovereign states. Countries that issue debt in their own currency occupy a fundamentally different position from those that do not. They can borrow without facing immediate external constraints. They can manage obligations over time. Inflation, while politically sensitive, remains a tool within their control. Countries that borrow in foreign currencies do not have this flexibility. They must earn or acquire the currency needed to repay. Inflation offers no relief. In fact, it often makes their situation worse by weakening domestic purchasing power. While obligations remain fixed in external terms, this distinction explains why some countries endure high debt without crisis, while others face repeated collapse. It is not discipline that separates them. It is position. The same logic applies within societies. Those who own assets that were priced with inflation experience protection. Real estate, equities, businesses, these adjust. Those who can renegotiate income, raise prices, or access credit early adapt faster. Inflation becomes manageable, sometimes even advantageous. Those who depend on fixed wages, fixed benefits, or savings denominated in currency do not share this protection. Their exposure is direct and immediate. Inflation is not something to manage. It is something to endure. This is why inflation reshapes inequality even when it appears modest. Small differences compound. Temporary erosion becomes permanent divergence. Over time, gaps widen not because effort declines, but because insulation differs. The system does not correct this automatically. It relies on it. Inflation allows governments to finance obligations that would otherwise provoke resistance. It allows debts to be serviced without explicit default. It preserves nominal stability while altering real outcomes. In doing so, it shifts pressure away from institutions and toward households. This is not framed as punishment. It is framed as necessity. When inflation rises, the language is always cautious. External shocks, supply constraints, global pressures, temporary distortions. The implication is that no one is responsible and that normality will soon return. But history suggests otherwise. Inflation rarely resolves the underlying tensions that produce it. It postpones them. It redistributes them. It makes them less visible. And in doing so, it becomes easier to repeat. This is why inflation returns across different eras, systems, and ideologies. Not because policymakers fail to learn, but because the mechanism works. It spreads cost without concentrating blame. It preserves continuity while eroding trust slowly enough to avoid immediate rupture. From the perspective of the system, this is a feature. From the perspective of those at the margins, it is a sentence. The uncomfortable truth is that modern economies are built on promises that exceed what stability alone can support. Growth is uneven. Shocks are inevitable. Political incentives discourage direct confrontation with limits. Inflation becomes the compromise that allows everything to continue. And continuation matters more than fairness. This does not mean inflation is always deliberate or consciously imposed. It means the structure tolerates it. It absorbs it. It relies on it when alternatives are politically costly. Once you see inflation as a mechanism rather than a mistake, the pattern becomes clear. It is not random. It is not neutral. And it does not punish equally. It punishes those with the least ability to protect themselves. This understanding reframes many familiar debates, discussions about discipline, responsibility, and effort take on a different meaning. Outcomes that appear individual are revealed as systemic. Stability that appears natural is revealed as managed. The poor are not punished because they are irresponsible. They are punished because they are exposed. They absorb volatility so that others do not have to. And this brings us back to the title of this video. Inflation always punishes the poor first because the system depends on someone absorbing the cost of adjustment. Someone has to. And those without assets, leverage, or flexibility are the easiest place to deposit it. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation. The question, then, is not whether inflation can be reduced or controlled. It is whether a system that repeatedly relies on inflation can ever be compatible with genuine equality of opportunity. History offers no easy reassurance. What it does offer is clarity. Inflation does not simply change prices. It changes relationships. It reshapes trust. It alters how people relate to work, savings, and the future. It teaches lessons, even when no one intends to teach them. And those lessons accumulate. If debt revealed who owns the system, inflation reveals who pays for it. Not once, not occasionally, but consistently. And until that structure changes, the outcome will not.